Ethan Carter had served plenty of wealthy, arrogant customers, but none like her. Victoria Lancaster sat at the VIP table, sipping red wine, her emerald eyes locked on him like a calculated hunter studying its prey. He felt it immediately, the undeniable pull between them. Her presence was magnetic, impossible to ignore. As he refilled her glass, her voice was like velvet, low, commanding. "Do you always hesitate when a woman looks at you like this, Ethan?" His breath caught. She knew his name. He wasn't wearing a name tag. He had never seen her before. Yet she spoke with the confidence of a woman who already owned him. Victoria took another slow sip of wine, letting the deep red liquid stain her lips before placing the glass down. Her nails tapped lightly against the stem, her gaze never leaving him. "Something on your mind, Ethan?" He straightened. He had been caught staring. "Just wondering if you always drink alone?" The corner of her lips lifted into a slow, wicked smile. "Only when I find someone worth sharing a drink with." The air between them thickened. Ethan could feel the heat creeping up his spine, a warning, a temptation. Then she did something unexpected. Victoria reached for a napkin, her movement slow and deliberate. She took a small black card from her purse, slid it inside the folded fabric and placed it next to her wine glass. "Call me, if you're not afraid." Then, without another word, she stood up, her silk dress hugging every dangerous curve, and walked away without looking back. Ethan stared at the napkin. His fingers twitched before he finally picked it up. Inside, a black card with gold letters, Victoria Lancaster, and just below, a private number. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. He had two choices. Ignore it, forget her, walk away from whatever. This was before it even started, or I'd step into a world that he knew damn well could destroy him. Ethan stared at the black card in his hand, feeling the weight of it as if it carried a warning. Or maybe a promise. He should have tossed it. He should have ignored the way her voice lingered in his mind, the way her scent, something dark and intoxicating, still clung to him. But he didn't. Instead, he pulled out his phone and dialed the number. "I was wondering how long it would take." Victoria's voice slid through the line like silk, smooth and controlled. Ethan exhaled, his pulse kicking up at the sound of her. "I don't usually call women who leave mysterious notes." A soft laugh. "I don't usually give my number to men who hesitate." Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken tension. "What is this?" Ethan finally asked. "An invitation." "To what?" "To something you can't walk away from." His throat dried. The sheer certainty in her voice made it impossible to think clearly. "Meet me tonight," she added, as if it weren't a request, but a decision already made. "I'll send a car." The call ended before he could refuse. The ride to Temptation 45. Minutes later, a black luxury car slid up to the curb where Ethan stood. The driver barely acknowledged him, simply opened the door and waited. Everything about it screamed danger, yet Ethan stepped inside. New York blurred past as the car sped through the city, heading toward a part of town he rarely ventured into. The kind of place where wealth wasn't just displayed, it was worshipped. When the car finally stopped, Ethan stepped out in front of a mansion that looked more like a modern palace. Glass walls, sleek architecture, and a view of the city that stretched endlessly behind it. The front door was already open, as if she'd been expecting him. And then, there she was, Victoria Lancaster. She stood at the top of the grand staircase, wearing a black silk dress that molded to her figure in ways that had his body reacting before his brain could catch up. Her lips curved into a knowing smile. "You're punctual." "That's a good sign." Ethan's jaw tightened as he climbed the steps. "Didn't want to keep you waiting." "Good." She tilted her head slightly. "Because I don't like waiting." She turned and walked inside, not looking back. Not needing to, Ethan followed, knowing damn well he was walking into something he'd never be able to escape. The tension between them thickened with every step Ethan took inside Victoria's mansion. The space was luxurious, sleek, the kind of wealth that didn't need to be flaunted because it was simply understood. But he barely noticed it. All he could focus on was her. Victoria walked ahead, her dress flowing over her curves, the sharp click of her heels on the marble floor the only sound in the vast space. She stopped near a low-lit bar, reaching for a crystal decanter and pouring a dark amber liquid into 2 glasses. Whiskey? Ethan smirked as he leaned against the bar, his eyes never leaving hers. Is that part of the invitation? She handed him a glass, her fingers grazing his just enough to send a current through his body. It's a test. I like to see how men handle strong things. Ethan took a slow sip, the burn sliding down his throat. You enjoy pushing limits, don't you? Victoria smiled, setting her glass down. I enjoy watching men try to resist what they already want. The challenge was there, naked and blatant. Ethan didn't hesitate this time. He closed the space between them, pressing her against the bar, his hand sliding over the silk of her dress, feeling the heat of her body underneath. Victoria's breath caught, but she didn't pull away. If anything, her lips parted slightly, waiting. Is this what you wanted? His voice was low, rough. Not yet. Then she kissed him. Not soft, not hesitant. Victoria owned the kiss, her mouth moving against his with a hunger that shattered any illusions of control he thought he had. Ethan groaned against her lips, gripping her waist, feeling the way her body fit perfectly against his. She pushed his jacket off his shoulders, her fingers moving with dangerous precision over the buttons of his shirt, each touch a promise, each kiss a demand. Before he knew it, he was backing her against the glass wall, the city skyline stretching behind them. But the only thing he could see was her. Victoria's nails scraped lightly against his skin as she pulled him closer. You feel that, Ethan? She whispered against his lips, her breath warm and teasing. He swallowed hard, his hands sliding over the curve of her hips, pulling her flush against him. Yeah, I do. And then neither of them spoke. There was only the heat, the urgency, the clash of lips and bodies as they unraveled each other, layer by layer, until there was nothing left between them but raw, burning need. The sheets were tangled, the scent of skin and sin still thick in the air. Ethan lay back, his chest rising and falling, his mind clouded with the aftermath of Victoria Lancaster. She was unlike any woman he'd ever been with, commanding, unapologetic, dangerous. He turned his head to find her already awake, propped, on one elbow watching him. A slow, knowing smirk played on her lips. Your quiet regrets? Ethan let out a dry laugh, running a hand over his face. Not even close. Victoria reached for a cigarette, lighting it with a flick of her wrist. The glow of the lighter reflected in her emerald eyes, making her look even more untouchable. Then what's on your mind? He exhaled, shifting to face her. You. Victoria arched a perfectly sculpted brow. Careful, Ethan. A man could get lost thinking about me too much. Ethan reached out, fingers tracing the delicate line of her collarbone, then lower, following the path of her barely covered skin. She didn't stop him. I think that was your plan all along, she smirked, taking a slow drag of her cigarette before exhaling the smoke with a practiced ease. You think I planned this? Ethan's gaze darkened. Didn't you, Victoria? Tilted her head, studying him. The silence between them was thick but not empty. Then, without answering, she slid out of bed. The silk sheet draped over her hips, revealing smooth golden skin and a body that had already left him wrecked. She crossed the room toward the massive glass window where the city lights stretched beneath them, like a kingdom she ruled. Tell me something, Ethan. Her voice was calm, but there was something underneath it, something unreadable. Do you believe in fate? Or do you think everything is just choices? Ethan sat up, watching her. I think powerful people don't believe in fate. They make their own rules. Victoria turned slightly, her lips curling in amusement. Good answer. She tapped the cigarette into a crystal ashtray before turning back to him. But you're wrong. Ethan narrowed his eyes. Then tell me, what am I doing here? Victoria walked back to the bed, stopping just at the edge. She leaned down, running her fingers through his hair, her lips close enough to make him breathless again. You're exactly where I want you to be. Her tone was absolute, final. And for the first time, Ethan wondered if he was playing the game, or if he was already losing. Ethan should have left. He knew that. Instead, he stayed. Days passed in a blur of tangled sheets, whispered promises, and a hunger that never seemed to fade. Victoria was fire beneath his hands, a drug in his veins, a storm he couldn't escape. But tonight something was different. She sat at the edge of the bed, legs crossed, wearing nothing but a silk robe that barely clung to her shoulders. The air smelled of whiskey and desire, but her expression was unreadable. Ethan was still catching his breath, his body marked by her nails when she finally spoke. "Marry me." His head snapped toward her, muscles tensing. "What?" Victoria reached for her glass of whiskey, swirling the liquid slowly before taking a sip. "You heard me." Ethan pushed himself up, gripping the sheet around his waist. "That's not funny." Victoria let out a low, amused chuckle. "Who said I was joking?" Ethan ran a hand through his hair, studying her carefully. "You barely know me." Victoria tilted her head, those sharp green eyes locked onto his, holding him captive. "I know enough." The silence between them stretched, thick and electric. She was serious. Ethan exhaled, shaking his head. "Why?" Victoria finished her. "Drink before setting the glass down, then turn to face him fully." "Because I need a husband." The words hit him like a slap. She wasn't asking for love. She wasn't asking for forever. She needed a deal. Ethan laughed bitterly, leaning back against the headboard. "And I'm the lucky bastard you picked?" Victoria smirked, running a finger along his jawline. "You're the only man I trust, not to betray me." That shut him up. She slid closer, pressing her bare leg against his. The scent of her, jasmine, vanilla, and something purely sinful, clouded his thoughts. "Say yes, Ethan, and in return, I'll make sure you never want for anything again." Ethan swallowed, his mind racing. Everything about this screamed danger. But so did she, and he had never been able to resist danger. "And what happens if I say no?" Victoria leaned in, her lips brushing against his ear as she whispered, "Then I'll have to convince you." And as her mouth claimed his again, he knew. He was already lost. The wedding wasn't grand. It wasn't a love story. It was a transaction. A contract sealed not with ink, but with fire. Ethan stood in the private hall of a five-star hotel, wearing an expensive tuxedo that Victoria had arranged for him. Everything about this was surreal, yet his pulse pounded like he was walking into battle. And then she arrived, Victoria Lancaster, his wife. She walked down the short aisle, wearing a white silk gown that clung to her curves like it had been designed to be sinful. The lace detail traced along her skin, teasing just enough to make him forget why he had ever thought of saying no. Her emerald eyes locked onto his, unwavering, unreadable. The officiant spoke, but Ethan barely heard a word. His entire world had narrowed to the woman in front of him. Then she took his hand and electricity shot through his veins. "Do you, Ethan Carter, take Victoria Lancaster as your lawfully wedded wife?" He swallowed hard. He could walk away. He could leave this world of power, seduction, and secrets behind, or he could take her, own her, let her own him. "I do." Victoria's lips curled slightly, like she had known his answer all along. "And do you, Victoria Lancaster, take Ethan Carter as your lawfully wedded husband?" She didn't even blink. "I do." The moment their lips met, it wasn't just a kiss. It was a claim. She kissed him like she was branding him, as if daring him to ever think of leaving. And Ethan, he kissed her back just as hard, just as reckless. The wedding night. The second the door to the penthouse closed, Victoria turned on him. "You're mine now, Ethan." Before he could respond, she grabbed his tie and pulled him into a kiss that stole the air from his lungs. It wasn't soft. It wasn't sweet. It was hunger, need, control. Ethan spun her around, pressing her against the wall, hands gripping her waist, tracing the lines of the body that now belonged to him. Victoria moaned against his lips, her nails dragging down his back as she arched into him. "You think you can handle me, husband?" Ethan's mouth moved to her neck, teasing, biting, owning. "I don't think, Victoria, I know." And that night, under the dim city lights filtering through the massive windows, they didn't just seal their marriage, they set it on fire. For Yossi, marriage was a game of power, but in the bedroom it was war. Every night Victoria pushed Ethan to his limits, and every night he pushed back. The penthouse turned into their battlefield. On the second night she walked in wearing nothing but a silk robe, her hair loose, her emerald eyes dark with intent. "Still standing, husband?" Ethan smirked, pulling her onto his lap. "You'll have to do better than that to break me." And she did. Victoria was relentless. She played him like a queen, moving her pieces on a chessboard, knowing exactly when to tease, when to take, when to let him think he had control. By the third night, Ethan realized he was losing himself in her, in the way she whispered his name like a secret, in the way her body responded to his touch. But it was the fourth night that changed everything. The first sign of secrets. Ethan woke up alone. The space beside him was still warm, but Victoria was gone. He sat up, running a hand through his hair, his mind clouded with the haze of their last hours together. The way she had looked at him, like he was becoming something more than just a contract. He pulled on a pair of pants and stepped into the hallway, following the dim light that leaked from her study. That's when he heard her voice, low, tense. He stopped before reaching the door. This wasn't the plan. Ethan's stomach tightened. The plan? He peeked through the small opening in the door. Victoria stood by the window, a phone pressed to her ear, her robe barely covering the marks his lips had left on her skin. "No, I don't trust him, but I need him." A cold wave crashed over Ethan's body. She was talking about him. His jaw clenched, muscles coiled, every instinct screaming at him to walk in and demand answers. But then, she sighed, rubbing her forehead. And for the first time, she looked tired, vulnerable. I know what's at stake, but if this goes wrong, I lose everything." She hung up. Ethan slipped back into the shadows before she could see him. His heart pounded. Victoria wasn't just hiding something, she was afraid. And for the first time since this started, Ethan wondered, who was really playing who? The tension between them was different now. It wasn't just desire, it was suspicion. Ethan lay awake that night, Victoria's body curled against his, her breathing slow, steady, too steady. She wasn't asleep. Neither was he. His mind replayed her words over and over. "No, I don't trust him, but I need him." She needed him. For what? By the seventh night of their marriage, Ethan couldn't take it anymore. The night of discovery. It was past midnight when he slipped out of bed, careful not to wake her. The penthouse was silent, except for the faint hum of the city outside. Everything about this place screamed wealth and power, but tonight it felt like a prison. He made his way to Victoria's office. The door was unlocked, too easy, too inviting. Inside, the dim glow of her desk lamp cast long shadows over stacks of documents, contracts, financial statements, and one black folder sitting at the center of it all. His name was on the cover. Ethan's stomach tightened. She had files on him, bank records, employment history, even a background check from years. Hargo, she had known exactly who he was before they ever met. Before that night at the restaurant, the realization hit like a punch to the ribs. This wasn't fate. It was a setup. "Didn't anyone ever teach you not to snoop, husband?" Ethan turned sharply. Victoria stood in the doorway, arms crossed over the silk robe that barely covered her body. She didn't look angry. She looked amused, like she had been waiting for him to find out. "So what's the truth, Victoria?" His voice was low, controlled, too controlled. She took a slow step forward. "The truth?" She trailed a finger along the desk, her eyes never leaving his. "The truth is that I don't make mistakes, and I don't let fate decide my future." Ethan clenched his jaw. "You picked me. Before we ever met." Yes, no hesitation, no guilt. She owned it, just like she owned him. Victoria leaned in, placing her hands flat against the desk, her body inches from his. "Are you going to run now, Ethan?" The challenge in her voice was clear. She wanted to see if he would break. His pulse thundered, but not just with anger, with something darker, something hotter. Ethan grabbed her wrist, pulling her against him. The scent of jasmine and power filled his lungs. You think you control everything, don't you? Her lips curled. Don't I? Ethan crushed his mouth against hers, kissing her the way he wanted to, brutal, possessive, desperate. She moaned against his lips, gripping his hair as if daring him to take his rage out on her. And he did. On the desk, against the wall, until they were both ruined. But when the heat faded, the truth remained. Victoria Lancaster was playing a game. And now? So was he. Ethan's breath was still uneven, his body tangled with Victoria's, the scent of sex and deception thick in the air. Their bodies were satisfied, but the war between them was far from over. Victoria lay beneath him, her emerald eyes gleaming in the dim light, watching him like a queen amused by her knight's rebellion. "Feel better now?" she whispered, her fingers trailing slow, lazy patterns over his chest. Ethan grabbed her wrist, pinning it to the desk beside her head. His body still craved her, but his mind was on fire. "You think this makes me forget what you've done?" She smirked, completely unbothered. "I think it makes you realize that no matter how much you fight it, you're still mine." Ethan clenched his jaw. She was right, and that made him hate her even more. He pushed off the desk, grabbing his shirt and pulling it over his shoulders. Victoria propped herself up on one elbow, her robe slipping down to reveal bare skin. "You're leaving." "I should have left a long time ago." He reached for the black folder with his name on it, flipping through the pages again. The proof was there. She had picked him before they ever met. "What's the real reason you married me, Victoria?" She sighed, as if his question bored her. "You already know the answer." Ethan shook his head. "No. I know what you want. Me to believe. I know you needed a husband for your inheritance, for your company, but that's not all of it, is it?" Her silence confirmed it. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, laughing bitterly. "You played me." Victoria sat up, folding her legs underneath her, completely unashamed, completely in control. "You let me." Ethan's hands curled into fists. "I won't be your pawn." "Then what are you still doing here?" The question hit like a punch to the ribs. Why was he still here? Victoria leaned forward, her voice softer now. "You don't trust me. I get that. But answer this. Do you really think you can walk away?" Ethan's pulse hammered. Could he? The woman he wanted to leave was the same woman he couldn't stop wanting. She was the drug and the poison, the fire and the oxygen. But this wasn't just about him anymore. Victoria was hiding something. Something bigger than her empire, bigger than their marriage. He needed to find out what. Ethan took one last look at her, at the way she sat there, waiting for him to make a move. Then he turned, grabbing the folder, and walked out. Victoria didn't stop him. She just whispered so softly he almost missed it. "You'll be back." And damn it, she was probably right. The city pulsed around Ethan as he walked, his mind spinning with the weight of what he had just discovered. Victoria had set him up. From the moment she saw him at the restaurant, she had chosen him, controlled him, manipulated him, and yet he still wanted her. He ran a hand through his hair, the night air doing little to cool the fire still raging inside him. Every inch of his body burned from her touch, from the way she whispered his name, from the way she knew exactly how to break him and put him back together. That should have been enough reason to stay away. But when his phone buzzed in his pocket, he didn't hesitate to check it. Victoria, a single message. "I'm waiting." Ethan cursed under his breath. Of course, she knew. She always did. The return. He never planned. It took him exactly 20 minutes to get back to the penthouse. The door was unlocked, just like last time. An open invitation. A trap. Victoria stood in the center of the dimly lit room, wearing nothing but a black silk robe that barely stayed on her shoulders. Her eyes held no fear, no guilt, just certainty. She smirked. "You came back." Ethan clenched his jaw. "You knew I would." She took a slow step forward, her perfume, jasmine and power curling around him like a noose. "You think you hate me?" Ethan exhaled sharply. "I do." Victoria traced a finger along his chest, her touch feather-light, a deliberate contrast to the tension coiled between them. "Then why do you look at me like you're about to destroy me?" Because he was. Ethan grabbed her, pushing her against the wall, his mouth crashing into hers with a force that made her gasp. She tasted like fire and whiskey, like something he'd never be able to quit. Victoria moaned into the kiss, her hands gripping his shoulders, nails digging in, welcoming the storm between them. "Tell me you don't want this," he murmured against her lips, his breath hot against her skin. She let out a low, breathless laugh. "I never lie." And then there were no more words, just heat, just her body molding into his, her robe slipping to the floor, the world disappearing as they gave into the one thing neither of them could fight. The city lights flickered through the massive windows, casting golden shadows across the tangled sheets. Victoria lay beside him, her breathing steady, her skin still marked by his hands, his lips, his claim. Ethan watched her in silence, his mind battling against the inevitable truth. He was falling for a woman he should never have trusted, and yet here he was, still in her bed, still aching for her even after the war they had waged against each other's bodies. Victoria stretched, her green eyes lazy and satisfied, but something flickered beneath the surface. A shadow, a secret she wasn't ready to tell. Ethan propped himself on one elbow, studying her. "What aren't you telling me?" Victoria's lips twitched, but there was no smirk this time. "You always ask the wrong questions." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Then give me the right answer." For the first time she hesitated. Then she sat up, reaching for the glass of whiskey on the nightstand, taking a slow sip before speaking. "I didn't just marry you for control of my company." Ethan's pulse kicked up. She turned to face him fully, her robe slipping down one shoulder, but there was no seduction in her movements this time. Only truth. "They're trying to destroy me, Ethan, and I needed someone they couldn't manipulate." He frowned. "Who?" Victoria exhaled, rubbing her fingers over her temple. "My son. The board. Everyone who wants me out." Ethan stared at her. "You're afraid." Her expression hardened. "I don't do fear." But the way her fingers tightened around her glass said otherwise. Ethan leaned closer, his voice low, sharp. "You didn't just marry me for power. You married me for protection." She met his gaze, and for the first time since he had met her, Victoria Lancaster looked vulnerable. Yes, the word sliced through him. Everything they had been, everything they had done, it had been real. But it had also been survival. Ethan exhaled. "Why didn't you just tell me?" Victoria smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Would you have believed me?" Silence stretched between them. Ethan already knew the answer. Then Victoria's phone rang. She picked it up, glanced at the screen, and the shift in her face was immediate. She didn't answer. She just set the phone down and whispered, "They're ready to take me down." Ethan's chest tightened, and for the first time he realized he wasn't just in this for her anymore. He was in it with her. Victoria's words lingered in the air, thick with tension. "They're ready to take me down." Ethan sat up, his body still buzzing from her touch, but his mind now sharper than ever. This was real, the danger, the threat, the war. He ran a hand over his jaw, studying her. She looked unshaken, but her eyes betrayed her. She was calculating, preparing. "What happens if you go to that meeting tomorrow?" he asked. Victoria exhaled, picking up her whiskey and swirling it slowly. "I fight." Ethan let out a dry laugh. "You don't trust anyone in that room, so how do you win?" She smirked, but there was no amusement in it. "I never lose, Ethan." But even as she said it, he saw it, the slight flicker of doubt in her eyes. She wasn't sure this time. Ethan's chest tightened. He had two options. One, walk away. Cut ties, leave this world of billionaires and deception behind. Victoria was dangerous, her life a ticking time bomb. If he left now, he'd survive. Two, stay. Stand by her side. Face the war with her. Be hers for real. Victoria turned to him, her green eyes assessing, testing. "You don't have to be part of this." Ethan let out a breath, watching her, memorizing every damn detail of the woman who had turned his life upside down. "Yes, I do." She didn't react right away. just blinked once, twice, and then, for the first time since they met, her confidence cracked. Her lips parted slightly, a soft inhale like she was about to say something, maybe something important, maybe something that would change everything. But instead she stepped closer, resting her hands against his chest. "Then you're mine, Ethan, no turning back." Ethan's hands gripped her waist, pulling her flush against him. "I was never going to turn back." And as he kissed her, deep, desperate, final, he knew one thing for certain: tomorrow they would fight, and no matter the outcome, they would burn together. The boardroom was silent, not with peace, but with tension so thick it could be cut with a knife. Victoria Lancaster sat at the head of the table, poised, controlled, every inch the ruthless billionaire they feared. Across from her, the men who had plotted against her. Her enemies, and beside her, Ethan. He stood tall, wearing a tailored suit that felt like armor. He wasn't just her husband anymore. He was her ally, her protector, her equal. The men at the table exchanged glances, expecting her to break, expecting her to lose. Instead, she smiled. "Are we done here?" A heavy silence followed. Then, one by one, the men nodded. She had won. Again. The real victory. Later that night, in the penthouse, Victoria leaned against the floor-to-ceiling window, a glass of whiskey in her hand, watching the city she now fully controlled. Ethan walked, up behind her, sliding his arms around her waist, pressing his lips to the curve of her neck. "You did it." Victoria smirked, tilting her head back against his chest. "No, Ethan." She turned in his arms, looking up at him. "We did." He studied her, his hands tightening around her hips. "So, what happens now?" Victoria's fingers traced along his jawline, her emerald eyes shining with something deeper than victory. "Now?" She leaned in, her lips brushing his. "Now, I keep you." And as she kissed him, slow and possessive, the way she did the first time, Ethan knew the truth. He wasn't trapped. He wasn't a pawn. He was exactly where he wanted to be. In the end, was it power that bound them together? Or was it something deeper, something neither of them could control? Victoria thought she was playing the game, but Ethan proved he wasn't just a piece. He was a force she hadn't planned. For to love, when entangled with power, becomes dangerous. It can be a weapon or a shield, a trap or salvation. But when two people refuse to surrender, when they choose each other despite the risks, what they create is unstoppable. Now tell me, do you believe love and power can truly coexist? Or is one always destined to destroy the other? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you crave another romance that will set your heart racing, don't go anywhere. The next story is waiting for you on the screen, one you won't want to miss. Click now and dive into another passionate journey.